Love it. Scoot in just a little bit. Now, as I said, the Holy Land, because of who was here. That whole palace area that you saw, where we stopped over there just to wait for a few minutes, that was known as the Upper Palace. This area over here, that's known as the Lower Palace. The whole palace complex was, if you want to know who walked there, not so holy of a person. Pontius Pilate, Festus, Felix, other types of Roman governors were in this area. You want to know where people walked? Pontius Pilate lived here. This was his headquarters, not Jerusalem. He only went there like once a year around Passover, but this is where he stayed here. The Upper Palace over here, where you were actually sitting just for a little short while, that particular place was where, in that area, the Apostle Paul was actually in prison. So when he was imprisoned here in Caesarea after being up in Jerusalem, the incident that happens in Jerusalem, and he finds out that a bunch of the Sanhedrin had vowed not to eat or drink anything until they killed him, they moved him down to here. Here he languishes under Felix the governor in that part of the palace over there in some sort of a cell for 2 years. So you were sitting in that particular area. Now this area right here where we're standing is something that the archaeologists have determined in the palace is known as the audience hall. The audience hall is in the Bible. You're standing in a biblical site. Let me read to you what happened. This is over in Acts chapter 25 rather, verse 6. And it says, "And when he had remained among them for more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. And the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought." Somewhere in this audience hall, maybe even right where I'm at, there was a thing called a judgment seat. A judgment seat has another name, and you're probably very familiar with it, but you think it only applies to one place in the empire. That's not true. The judgment seat was known as a bema seat, and they were everywhere. They were especially in places like marketplaces that might have been attached to some sort of a civic building or a palace. I'm going to explain about one of those when we get to Jerusalem, because there's a very important one where we know the approximate location of it. But there was a judgment seat. It was probably right about where I'm standing, because the audience room would come in this way and the people would be here. It was an elevated platform, and there on top of the platform would have been someone who would have been very, very important, a governor, a magistrate, or even on occasion an emperor, but not here, of course. So the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. And when he had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul, which they could not prove, while he answered for himself. He had no lawyer answering for him. They accused him, and he had to represent himself. That's unfair. "Neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all," Paul said. Where did he say these things? Right where you're standing. It happened here. You're standing on the place. Oh, but it gets better. "But Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, 'Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things?' So Paul said, 'I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged.'" That would be right here. "To the Jews, I have done no wrong, as long as you know very well. For if I am an offender or I have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But if there is nothing in these things which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar." These words were spoken in this room, right here. Now, I'm going to tell you one more quick story, and it happened in the Upper Palace. The Upper Palace also had a very large audience room for very formal occasions, and this is where Paul was moved just a few days later to address Festus, Agrippa, and Bernice. And you may remember that, where he, at the very end, he says, it said to him, "Paul, your great learning has driven you mad," after he has shared his testimony. And then he says, "I would that all of you would become as I am." In other words, a Christian. Except for being in these chains, which he rattled, and that would have happened in that room over there. I just want to remind you that when they told Paul to give a defense for himself, what did he do to defend himself? He shared his testimony. He didn't say, "Well, I've been good." He shared his testimony, and he did it 4 times in the book of Acts. He shared his testimony. "Let me defend myself." Here's what Jesus did for me. Listen, each of you have a testimony. Some of you might think it's not big and gory, not enough to share, but let me tell you something. God uses it. Every single person has a story, and God uses your story to tell it to somebody else to say what He did in your life. How He changes people, how He forgives the unforgivable. This is what He's done for us. That's what He's given you. You also have the same type of message. The Apostle Paul shared it right over there. You can share it right even here. I love it. Bless you guys. Let's move on to our next stop. Okay?